45 million pairs of shoes. That's not what Imelda Marcos left in her will. And it's not what Susan has in her closets. But 45 million pairs of shoes are the number of shoes produced in Rochester in 1933, according to the Democrat and Chronicle. How many of you knew that Rochester was at one point one of the leading shoe manufacturing cities in the country? No one. It's been a long time. The last shoe manufacturer, I believe, closed in 2000. There's still one out in Batavia, but in terms of Rochester, it was gone by the turn of the new century. Shoe manufacturing started in 1815 in Rochester. There were 300 people in the city. It wasn't even the city, it was the village. But there was the first shoe manufacturer. But by 1831, we were up to almost 100. What got me thinking about shoes were these buildings. The bottom right is at the corner of Clifford and Portland. Ride by it on the bus every day, looking at it saying, gee, I wonder what that building is. It's now Elmer Davis. But I'm like, that building is old. You can tell it's old. Drove by, looked, it said 1911 on the cornerstone. I said, well, what was it? It was the Menahan Shoe Company. So I did a little research. The Menahan Shoe Company was there from 1911 till 1950 something. It went bankrupt. It then moved out to Greece someplace. But what's interesting is that the building on the left was also the Menahan Shoe Company. It's on North Water Street. It was there up to 1911. And then, if anyone worked at the old Excellus building, I don't think anybody here worked on Main Street. Well, the building in the top right, that white building, was sort of, I guess, the annex or something. The cafeteria was over there. It was part of the old Edwards building. It was connected over by a walkway. And the building, the red building there was the Cox building, the Cox Shoe Company building. Again, these old buildings are history of Rochester. And just want to encourage you to take a look as you drive around the city. You see these old buildings, kind of think, what were these buildings? Well, the reason I'm talking about shoes is that it was the second boom industry in Rochester. The milling, the flour city, F-L-O-U-R. We were a big mill company town. After the mills sort of faded away, shoe power came out. So we were a little footwear. As I said, we had close to 100 shoe companies early in our history. The working hours were 12 to 16-hour days, $6 to $9 a week, early 1800s. And they say that workers were satisfied with that. It comes from Jesse Hatch, who was one of the early shoe manufacturers. Workers were satisfied with that. But we were far away from the major population centers. New York City, Philadelphia, Boston. Those were the population centers at the time. The Erie Canal brought a lot of people out here and allowed us to ship shoes east and west. But there were big shoe manufacturing centers in Boston, north of Boston, in Philadelphia, in Brooklyn. So we had to compete against those markets. The only way we could compete against those markets was by producing the best shoes possible. And that was something that was known about Rochester shoes. They were quality shoes. We focused mainly on women's shoes. All right, so during the wars, we didn't get government contracts for shoes, although in the Civil War, we did manufacture some men's shoes for the war effort, but in World War I, we were excluded because there weren't a lot of women walking around on the battlefield in women's shoes. We had patents. I mean, there were the Hatch Shoe Company, other shoe companies invented processes to make shoes better, cheaper, and more shoes. They used manufacturing techniques, the Singer sewing machine was used in 1852 to manufacture, I guess, the top of the shoe. So Hatch had to develop something for the sole. So he developed a die cutting tool to make multiple soles of shoes. Again, just increase the output. We were producing, in the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, we were producing about $1.4 million worth of shoes. By the late 1870s, we were up to about $37 million in shoes. The shoe industry in Rochester was the #1 industry from about the end of the Depression in 1873 to the end of 1880. Led in employment, in wages, and in value added. The trouble was the techniques to produce more shoes, the sewing machine, other technology led to conflicts between the worker and the owner. So there were constantly strikes. Unions coming in, organizing workers, striking because the management wanted to cut wages by 30%. But then sometimes the unions won, sometimes the unions lost. So unions were coming and going. If they lost, they pretty much went out of business, that the union did. The businesses were there. If they won the strike, that's great. If they lost the strike, sometimes they went out of business. There were efforts by the manufacturers to produce cheaper shoes because they thought they could sell them better. But the manufacturing community in Rochester understood cheap shoes didn't work for Rochester because cheap shoes could be made on the East Coast and sold cheap in New York City. We needed to produce the best shoes. Well, after about 1890, the shoe industry started to fade. Clothing was the #1 industry at that point. Workers started going to other places. So they could go to shoes, they could go to Kodak at that point. They could go to machine shops. So the shoe industry started to fade. It maintained strength up until about 1922 when a big strike hit, and then the French dress designers raised the hems on the skirts so that you could see the shoes. Women wanted to focus on the shoes. Rochester didn't react, and we were stuck with a lot of excess shoes, and it started a gradual downward trend. And as I said, we lasted till about 2000. So next time you're driving around, take a look at the shoe companies. In a couple weeks, I'll talk about clothing. It's Adam Toastmaster.